Before the monitors stopped beeping, before the last visitor signed out at the front desk, a woman in a hospital bed who hadn't spoken in 3 days opened her eyes and whispered something that made the night shift freeze. "Did any of my children come?" The nurse beside her didn't answer fast enough, and so the woman asked the second question, the one that was worse. "Or did they finally forget me completely?" In the doorway, a man who had built an empire on silence stood perfectly still. Because men like Cormac Brenna had learned to ignore gunshots, they had learned to walk through threats without flinching. But no one had taught him how to stand in a doorway and hear his own mother ask if she'd been forgotten. The quiet nurse looked up. Their eyes met, and neither of them looked away. St. Aldrich's Memorial sat on the eastern edge of the city, in a neighborhood that had once been called promising and was now called nothing at all, because no one talked about it anymore. The hospital had been built in 1957, when the steel mills still ran 3 shifts, and the streets outside hummed with the particular energy of people who believed tomorrow would be better than today. But the mills had closed. The energy had drained away, and St. Aldrich's had become a place where the hallway lights buzzed with a frequency that got inside your teeth, where the linoleum had been mopped so many times it had lost any memory of its original color, where the vending machines took your money and gave you nothing, and no one was surprised. The 4th floor was long-term care. That was the polite name for it. The less polite name was the place you went when no one was coming to take you home. The rooms here smelled of antiseptic and something underneath it. Faintly sweet, faintly sour, something the cleaning staff could never quite reach. The windows faced east, which meant the patients got the morning sun, but by afternoon the light had moved on, leaving the rooms in a gray stillness that seemed to settle into the walls. Room 414 was at the end of the hall. It had a single bed, a single chair, a television mounted on a bracket that hadn't worked in 4 months, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot where the painted lines had faded to suggestions. There were no flowers on the nightstand, no cards taped to the wall, no photographs propped against the plastic water pitcher. The room had the quality of a place that had been forgotten while someone was still living in it, as if the world had already begun to move on, and only the woman in the bed remained, holding her place against the current. That woman was Aelith Brenna, and she had been here for 19 days. The nurse who had asked nothing and stayed anyway was named Carenza Morrow. She was 34 years old. She had auburn hair that she kept pinned back with 2 clips she'd bought at a dollar store 3 years ago because they were the only ones that didn't slide out during a 12-hour shift. Her eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, brown with flecks of something lighter underneath, and they carried the particular weariness that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from years of watching people leave rooms they would never return to. She had worked at St. Aldrich's for 7 years. Before that, she had worked at a hospital in Coalbridge, 40 miles south, until the commute became impossible because her car had started making a sound that mechanics quoted $400 to fix, and she had $62 in her account. Before that, she had worked at a nursing home in her hometown while taking night classes 3 times a week because her mother had told her once, when Carenza was 16, that the only person who would ever take care of her was herself. Her mother had been right about that, also wrong about some other things. But that particular lesson had proven reliable. Carenza had a daughter. Her name was Blythe. She was 9 years old and had the same auburn hair and the same creekwater eyes, and a gap between her front teeth that made her smile look like a secret she was letting you in on. Blythe was the reason Carenza worked doubles. Blythe was the reason Carenza had learned to sleep in 2-hour increments and eat standing up and never, not once in 9 years, call in sick even when her body begged her to. Blythe was also the reason Carenza stayed in a city she couldn't afford, in an apartment with a radiator that clanged like a ghost trying to escape, in a job that paid $17 an hour and asked for everything she had. Because Blythe was in a school here, a good one. The kind with a music program and a teacher who had noticed that Blythe could draw, really draw, not just the scribbles of a child, but the careful lines of someone who saw the world in shapes and shadows. And that teacher had recommended a summer art camp that cost $400, and Carenza had said yes before she'd done the math because the look on Blythe's face had made the math irrelevant. The math, when she finally did it, said, pick up extra shifts, say yes to every double, eat less, drive less, turn the heat down another 2 degrees. The math said, you'll make it if nothing goes wrong. But something always went wrong. That was the other lesson her mother had taught her. 3 weeks ago, it had been the car again. Not the same sound. A different one. Worse. 2 weeks ago, it had been Blythe's glasses, snapped in half during recess, held together now with tape and hope. 1 week ago, it had been the electric bill, higher than expected because the winter had come early and hard, and the radiator ghost had been working overtime. Carenza had done what she always did. She had moved numbers from one column to another. She had eaten rice for dinner 4 nights in a row. She had picked up a shift from another nurse who wanted the weekend off. She had told Blythe that everything was fine, that the glasses would be fixed soon, that the art camp was definitely happening, that there was nothing to worry about. And then she had sat in the break room at 2 a.m., drinking coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the previous administration, and stared at her phone and calculated how many shifts stood between her and the $400. The answer was 12. 12 more doubles. 6 weeks. If nothing else went wrong. She had put the phone away and gone back to room 414, where an old woman lay alone in a bed that no one visited, and she had done the thing that wasn't in her job description. The thing she did anyway. The thing that probably made her a bad employee and definitely made her a good human. She had pulled the single chair closer to the bed, and she had sat down, and she had held Aelith Brenniscost's hand in the dark, because the chart said the woman's family had been notified 19 days ago, and the chair beside the bed said no one had come. Carenza had not always been this careful with her hope. There had been a time, it felt like someone else's life now, when she had believed that love was something you could build with another person, brick by brick, until it became a house you both lived in. She had believed this when she was 23 and met a man named Desmond Vickers at a hospital fundraiser, where she was serving drinks, and he was wearing a suit that cost more than her rent. Desmond had hands that looked like they'd never held anything heavier than a pen. He had a voice like warm water. He had a way of looking at Carenza that made her feel like she was the only solid thing in a room full of smoke. He had also, as it turned out, a way of making her feel like she was the source of every problem he'd ever had. It started small, a comment about the way she laughed. Too loud, he said. People were looking. A suggestion about her clothes. Maybe something less attention-seeking. A question about why she needed to talk to that coworker so long. What were they discussing? Was there something she wanted to tell him? Carenza had explained. She had adjusted. She had made herself smaller in increments so gradual she didn't notice she was shrinking until the day she looked in the mirror and couldn't find herself. Blythe had been 2 years old when Desmond's words became hands. Not often. Not every day. Just often enough that Carenza learned to read the weather of his moods, to chart the pressure systems of his silences, to know by the way he set his keys on the counter whether the night would be calm or whether she would need to put Blythe in the bedroom with the door locked and the television turned up loud. She had stayed for 3 years after that first time. She had stayed because he apologized, because he cried, because he promised, because her mother had died the year before and left her nothing but a paid-off car and a lesson about self-reliance that suddenly seemed impossible to practice. She had stayed because leaving required money she didn't have, a plan she couldn't make, and a certainty she couldn't find. The night she finally left, Blythe was 5 years old. Desmond had come home late. He had been drinking. Not enough to stumble. Just enough to make his eyes go flat in that way Carenza had learned to fear. She had said something. She couldn't even remember what. Something small. Something meaningless. Something that shouldn't have mattered. He had grabbed her arm hard enough to leave fingerprints that would purple by morning. He had pulled her close and said something about respect, about gratitude, about everything he'd done for her. And Carenza had looked over his shoulder and seen Blythe standing in the hallway. Not crying, not screaming, just standing there, watching. With her small hand pressed flat against the wall like she was trying to hold the house up. That was the fracture, not the grip on her arm, not the words. The image of her daughter, 5 years old, learning to be still, learning to be silent, learning that this was what love looked like. Carenza had waited until Desmond fell asleep. She had packed one bag. She had carried Blythe to the car her mother had left her, the one that still smelled faintly of cigarettes and lavender perfume. And she had driven for 4 hours without stopping until she reached a city where no one knew her name. She had never gone back. She had never called. She had erased Desmond Vickers from her life the way you erase a mistake from a ledger. Completely, deliberately, with a firm hand. But Blythe still sometimes stood very still when voices got loud, and Carenza still sometimes flinched when a man moved too fast in her peripheral vision. Some erasures leave marks. 4 years in this city had taught Carenza the particular mathematics of survival. She knew which grocery store marked down bread on Tuesday nights. She knew which gas station had the pump that didn't charge the extra processing fee. She knew that the free clinic on Hallworth Street would see Blythe for minor illnesses if they arrived before 7 in the morning, and that the library on Connell Avenue had a homework help program on Wednesdays that meant Blythe had somewhere safe to be while Carenza worked her second shift. She knew how to make $11 last 4 days. She knew how to explain to a 9-year-old why they couldn't have the cereal with the cartoon on the box. She knew how to stand in front of an open refrigerator and feel the particular shame of counting eggs. But the mathematics had become harder lately. Desmond had found her. Not in person. Not yet. But 3 weeks ago, a letter had arrived at her apartment. An apartment whose address she had told no one, given to no one, registered under a version of her name that dropped the middle initials she'd used when they were together. The letter was from a lawyer. It used words like custody and visitation rights and parental alienation. It said that Desmond Vickers wished to establish a relationship with his daughter. It said that if Carenza did not respond within 30 days, further legal action would be taken. She had read it standing at the kitchen counter while Blythe did homework at the table. She had kept her face still. She had folded the letter and put it in her pocket and asked Blythe about her math test. And later, after Blythe was asleep, she had unfolded it and read it again and felt the ground shift beneath her. He didn't want Blythe. Carenza knew that with the certainty of someone who had spent 6 years studying a man's every tell. Desmond had never wanted Blythe, not as a daughter, not as a person. He had wanted her as a possession, as proof, as a way to extend his reach into the parts of Carenza's life he could no longer touch. This was not about fatherhood. This was about control. But the law didn't know that. The law saw a father who had never been formally denied custody. The law saw a mother who had fled without documentation, without police reports, without the paper trail that turned suffering into evidence. Carenza had gone to a legal aid clinic the next day. She had sat in a plastic chair in a waiting room that smelled like floor wax and despair, and she had told her story to a woman with kind eyes and a legal pad full of notes. The woman had listened. Then she had said, "You'll need a family lawyer. A good one. The free consultations I can give you won't be enough for what you're describing." How much? Retainer for a custody case? $3,000 minimum? Often more. Carenza had thanked her. She had walked to her car. She had sat in the driver's seat for 11 minutes without starting the engine because she needed to do the math, and the math needed silence. $3,000. Plus the $400 for Blythe's art camp. Plus the electric bill. Plus the car payment. Plus the glasses. The number was impossible. The number was a wall. And on the other side of that wall, Desmond Vickers was waiting. Patient. Certain. Knowing that time was on his side because time is always on the side of people who have money. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, Carenza had picked up every available shift. She had sold her mother's necklace, the only piece of jewelry she'd kept, to a pawn shop on Meridian Street for $80 less than it was worth because she didn't have time to negotiate. She had stopped buying coffee. She had started skipping lunch. And she had continued to come to room 414 every night, to sit beside a woman whose family had abandoned her, because something in Carenza recognized something in Aelith Brenna. The recognition of women who had been left behind. The night Cormac Brenna appeared in the doorway, Carenza had been awake for 19 hours. She had $847 saved toward the lawyer. She had a letter in her apartment that was now 23 days old, which meant she had 7 days left to respond. And she was holding the hand of a dying woman whose son ran half the city and hadn't visited once. Cormac Brenna did not look like what most people expected. The men who worked for him, and there were many, spread across 3 counties, embedded in businesses and unions and quiet offices where decisions were made without minutes being taken, sometimes described him to newcomers as the kind of man you don't notice until it's too late. This was meant as a compliment. It was also accurate. He was 57 years old. He had gray hair that he wore short, almost military, and eyes the color of slate after rain, pale and hard and difficult to read. His face had the weathered quality of a man who had spent time outdoors in his youth, though he hadn't done physical labor in 30 years. He dressed well, but not ostentatiously. Dark suits, simple ties, shoes that cost a great deal but didn't announce it. He looked like a businessman, a contractor maybe, someone who built things. In a sense, he did build things. He built systems. He built loyalties. He built networks of obligation and debt that functioned more reliably than any contract a lawyer could draft. He had never raised his voice in a negotiation. He had never needed to. The empire Cormac ran had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. Though his grandfather had operated on a smaller scale, in a different city, with cruder methods. Each generation had refined the operation. Each generation had made it more invisible. By the time Cormac inherited it at 31, the Brenna organization looked from the outside like nothing more than a series of legitimate businesses. Waste management, construction, private security, a few commercial properties. Only those who knew where to look could see the architecture beneath. Cormac had not visited his mother in 19 days because he had been in Montreal handling a situation that required his personal attention. A supplier had become unreliable. Unreliable suppliers created vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities had to be addressed. He had sent flowers. He had instructed his assistant to ensure the hospital provided the best possible care. He had done what he always did, delegated the human details to people paid to manage them. But his assistant had called this morning with news that changed things. Aelith's condition had worsened. The doctors were using phrases like making her comfortable and a matter of time. And so Cormac had boarded a plane and driven straight from the airport to St. Aldrich's Memorial, still wearing the suit he'd put on in Montreal, still carrying the weight of decisions made in rooms where the stakes were measured in millions. He had expected to find his mother alone. He had expected to find her sleeping. He had expected to stand in the doorway and feel whatever it was he was supposed to feel, then make arrangements for whatever came next. He had not expected to find a nurse in faded scrubs sitting beside the bed, holding his mother's hand in the dark, asking nothing and expecting nothing in return. and he had not expected to hear his mother's voice. Thin, fragile, but unmistakably hers. Ask if any of her children had come. The question had frozen him. Not because it was unfair. It was entirely fair. He had not come. His sister Neve had not come. She lived in Portland now, and hadn't spoken to the family in 6 years. His brother Declan had not come because Declan was serving 8 years in a federal facility for charges that could have been much worse if Cormac hadn't intervened. None of them had come, and their mother, who was 79 years old and dying in a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and regret, had noticed. Cormac stood in the doorway and watched the nurse hold his mother's hand. He watched the way she leaned forward, the way her thumb moved in small circles across the papery skin, the way she was present in a manner that required no audience and expected no reward. And a wall he had spent 40 years building began to crack, because he remembered another hospital, another bed, another woman lying alone while the people who should have been there weren't. He had been 12 years old. His mother had been in St. Bridget's across town, recovering from a fall down the stairs that everyone knew wasn't a fall. His father had told the children not to visit. She needs rest, he'd said, which meant, she has bruises I don't want to explain. And Cormac had obeyed, because at 12, you obeyed Seamus Brenna, or you learned what disobedience cost. But one night, he had snuck out. He had taken 2 buses across the city. He had walked into St. Bridget's and found his mother's room and stood in the doorway just like he was standing now. She had been alone. No flowers, no cards, the television playing to no one. And she had looked up and seen him and said, "You shouldn't have come, love. You'll get in trouble." Not, "I'm so glad you're here." Not, "I missed you." You'll get in trouble. Because even then, even broken and alone in a hospital bed, she had been protecting him from his father. She had been putting his safety above her own loneliness. He had sat with her for 2 hours. He had held her hand. He had promised her, silently, in the way children make promises they don't have words for, that someday he would have enough power that no one would ever hurt her again. And then he had gone home, and his father had been waiting. And the lesson Cormac learned that night was not about love, but about the cost of showing it. Now he was 57 years old. His father had been dead for 26 years, and his mother was lying in another hospital bed, alone again, and the only person who had stayed was a stranger in scrubs with tired eyes and a gentle hand. Cormac stepped into the room. The nurse looked up. Their eyes met. And in that moment, Cormac saw something he recognized. Not fear, though there was caution in her posture, the automatic assessment of a woman who had learned to read danger in the set of a man's shoulders. Not pity, either. Something else. Exhaustion. The bone-deep exhaustion of someone who gives more than they have because they don't know how to stop. He had seen that exhaustion before. In a hospital bed in St. Bridget's, 45 years ago, looking back at him from his mother's face. Carenza stood up slowly, placing herself between the man in the doorway and the bed. It was automatic, the geometry of protection she had learned without knowing she was learning it. Visiting hours ended at 8, she said. Her voice was steady, professional. The voice she used when families arrived angry, when doctors dismissed her concerns, when the world required her to be smaller than she felt. The front desk can help you schedule. I'm her son. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Carenza looked at him again. At the suit that cost more than her monthly rent. At the face that gave nothing away. At the eyes that were fixed not on her, but on the woman in the bed behind her. "You're Cormac," she said. It wasn't a question. She had read the chart. She had seen the emergency contact information. She had wondered, during 19 days of sitting beside a woman who spoke of her children with a love that seemed to exist independent of their presence, what kind of son could stay away this long. Now she knew. the kind who wore suits like armor and stood in doorways like he owned them. "She's been asking for you," Carenza said. She didn't soften it. She didn't wrap it in the gentle language nurses were trained to use. "Every day, sometimes twice a day, she asks if anyone has come." Cormac's jaw tightened. It was the only movement, the only crack in the stillness of his face. "I was out of the country." "For 19 days?" The question hung between them. Carenza knew she should stop. She knew that this man was powerful in ways she couldn't see, that challenging him was foolish, that her job was to provide care and not commentary. But something in her, the thing that made her hold the hands of dying strangers, the thing that made her skip meals so her daughter could go to art camp, the thing that had once walked out of a house at midnight carrying a sleeping child, would not be silent. "She thought you'd forgotten her," Carenza said. "She asked me tonight." Those were her words. "Did they finally forget me completely?" Cormac was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the control that had coated it. "What's your name?" "Carenza. Carenza Morrow." "How long have you been sitting with her, Carenza Morrow?" "Tonight, about 3 hours." "And before tonight?" Carenza hesitated. "Most nights, when I can. When my shift allows." "Why?" The question was simple. The answer wasn't. "Because no one should die alone," she said. "And no one should lie in a bed for 19 days wondering if they've been forgotten, even if they have been." Cormac took a step into the room, then another. He moved past Carenza, not pushing, not crowding, just moving with the deliberate pace of a man who was used to space rearranging itself around him. He stopped at the edge of the bed and looked down at his mother. Aelith was asleep now. Her breathing was shallow, her face slack in a way that made her look both older and younger than her 79 years. Her hands lay on top of the blanket, thin and spotted, the IV port taped to the back of her left hand with medical precision. Cormac reached out and touched her hand, just the tips of his fingers against her knuckles. The gentleness of it was startling, like watching a building lean down to examine a flower. "She used to sing," he said quietly. He wasn't talking to Carenza, not exactly. He was talking to the room, to the air, to the years that had piled up between this moment and whatever he was remembering. "When I was young, she had a voice. Like—" He stopped, shook his head once. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Carenza said. Cormac looked at her. For the first time, his eyes seemed to actually see her, not as an obstacle or a witness or a nurse in faded scrubs, but as a person standing in the same room as him, breathing the same antiseptic air, carrying the same awareness that the woman in this bed was running out of time. "You've been here every night," he said, holding her hand, sitting in that chair. "And you don't even know her." "I know enough." "What do you know?" Carenza glanced at Aelith's sleeping face. "I know she raised 3 children alone after her husband died. I know she worked at a textile mill for 31 years. I know she's afraid of thunderstorms because something happened when she was a girl that she won't talk about. I know she prays every night, even though she says she's not sure anyone's listening. I know she loves her children more than they deserve." The last words came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't take them back. Cormac was silent. His hand still rested on his mother's knuckles. His face had changed. The mask hadn't fallen, exactly, but it had shifted, revealing something underneath that looked almost like grief. "Her husband didn't die," he said. "My father. He didn't die when we were young. She just told people that because it was easier than explaining." Carenza waited. "He was a violent man," Cormac said. "He hurt her. For years. And when he finally did die, when I was 31, she was so used to being afraid that she didn't know how to stop." He looked at Carenza then, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't expected. Recognition. The same recognition she had felt the first time she sat beside Aelith's bed and understood, without being told, that this woman had survived something. "You know," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Carenza said. "I know." The room held its breath. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. And somewhere in the space between them, a door opened in a wall that had been closed for a very long time. They sat on opposite sides of the bed as the night stretched toward morning. Cormac had taken the chair Carenza usually sat in, not because she offered it, but because she had gestured toward it without thinking. The automatic hospitality of someone who had learned to make space for others. She stood by the window now, her arms crossed, watching the parking lot lights flicker in the darkness. Aelith slept between them, her breath a thin thread of sound. "She talked about you," Carenza said after a while. "All of you. Cormac, Niamh, Declan. She knows where each of you are, what you're doing. Even the ones who don't call. She shouldn't waste her energy on us. That's not how mothers work." Cormac almost smiled. It was a strange expression on his face, like a muscle that hadn't been used in years trying to remember its function. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." The silence returned. But it was a different silence now, not the silence of strangers, but the silence of two people deciding whether to trust each other with something heavy. Carenza broke it first. "I need to tell you something," she said. "About why I've been coming here. Why I've been sitting with her. You said no one should die alone. That's true. But it's not the whole truth." She turned from the window. Her face was tired in a way that went deeper than the 19-hour shift, deeper than the missed meals and the broken glasses, and the letter sitting in her apartment like a bomb with a 7-day fuse. "I've been coming here because your mother reminds me of someone." "Who?" "Me. In 30 years, if I'm not careful. If I don't." She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "Your mother survived something terrible. She raised her children anyway. She worked and sacrificed and gave everything she had. And now she's lying in a bed in a hospital that's falling apart, and the people she gave everything to aren't here. I'm here now. After 19 days. The words hit their mark. Carenza saw it in the way Cormac's shoulders tightened, the way his hand pressed harder against his mother's knuckles. "I'm not judging you," she said, though she wasn't sure that was true. "I'm saying, I look at her and I see a warning. I see what happens when you pour yourself out for people who don't pour back. And I'm terrified. That's where I'm heading." "Why would you be heading there?" And then, because she was exhausted, because she had 7 days left, because this man had shown her a crack in his armor and she felt somehow that she owed him one in return, Carenza told him. She told him about Desmond, about the 6 years of shrinking, about the night she'd seen her daughter frozen in the hallway, learning to be silent, about the drive through the darkness with nothing but a sleeping child and her mother's car. She told him about the 4 years since, about the mathematics of survival, about the grocery store on Tuesday nights and the clinic on Hallworth Street, and the radiator that clanged like a ghost. She told him about Blythe, about the art camp and the broken glasses, and the teacher who had noticed something special. About the way Blythe still went very still when voices got loud, and she told him about the letter, about Desmond's lawyer, about the 30 days and the $3,000 and the 7 days remaining. "He doesn't want her," Carenza said. Her voice had gone flat, the way voices go when they're carrying too much to allow for inflection. "He wants to control me. He wants to prove that no matter how far I run, he can still reach me. And I don't have enough money to stop him. I don't have a lawyer. I don't have family. I have a daughter who trusts me to keep her safe, and a countdown clock that's almost out of time." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She hadn't realized she'd started crying. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she said. "You're a stranger. Your mother is my patient. This is completely inappropriate. I just—" "Carenza?" She stopped. Cormac was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. His face was still controlled, still guarded, but something in his eyes had changed. Something had opened. My mother, he said slowly, spent 30 years married to a man who broke her bones and blamed her for it. She didn't leave because she had 3 children and no money and a family who told her that marriage was sacred and suffering was a woman's lot. She stayed because the world gave her no way out. He stood up, moved around the bed until he was standing in front of Carenza, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. I spent my whole life building something, he said. An organization, a network, power. I told myself it was about business, about legacy. But the truth is, I built it because I was 12 years old watching my mother lie in a hospital bed alone, and I swore that one day I would have enough power to make sure no one could ever hurt the people I cared about again. He paused. His voice dropped. I failed her. I let 19 days pass while she lay here wondering if her children had forgotten her. That failure is mine, and I will carry it. But I am standing here now, Carenza Morrow, and I am telling you, you are not going to become my mother. You are not going to pour yourself out and end up alone. Not if I can prevent it. Carenza shook her head. You don't even know me. I know enough. It was the same thing she had said to him an hour ago, when he'd asked what she knew about his mother. The echo of it hung in the air. I know you've been sitting with a dying woman every night because your heart wouldn't let you leave her alone, Cormac said. I know you're raising a daughter by yourself while a man who hurt you tries to use the law as a weapon. I know you're running out of time and money and options. And you're still here, holding my mother's hand, because that's who you are. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. I know people, he said. Lawyers who don't lose. People who can make problems disappear. I'm not offering you charity. I'm not asking for anything in return. I'm asking if you'll let me help. Carenza stared at him. Her chest felt tight. Her eyes were burning. Why? She whispered. Cormac looked at his mother's sleeping face. When he spoke, his voice was rough at the edges. Because 45 years ago, I sat in a hospital room and promised a woman I would never let her be alone again. I broke that promise. I can't undo that. But I can make sure someone else's daughter doesn't grow up the way I did, watching her mother break herself against a world that refused to help. He met Carenza's eyes. Let me help. Please. The word please changed everything, because men like Cormac Brenna did not say please. Men with empires and networks and power did not ask permission. And the fact that he was asking, the fact that he had made it a choice, her choice, was the thing that finally broke through her defenses. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Cormac made 3 phone calls. The first was to a man named Whelan, who answered on the second ring despite the hour. Cormac spoke in short, precise sentences. A name, Desmond Vickers. A city, Coalbridge. A situation, custody threat. History of domestic violence. 7 days remaining. I want everything, Cormac said. Employment, finances, associations, anything that doesn't survive sunlight. Have it to me by tomorrow evening. The second call was to a woman named Petra Langston. She was, Cormac explained after he hung up, one of the finest family law attorneys in the state. She had argued before the state Supreme Court twice and won both times. She charged $800 an hour and had a waiting list 4 months long. She would see Carenza tomorrow at 9 in the morning. I can't afford... Carenza started. She's on retainer, Cormac said. My retainer. Her fee is handled. I can't accept that. You're not accepting anything. I'm making a phone call. What you do at the meeting is your choice. He paused. She's going to ask you for documentation. Everything you have. Hospital records, photographs, testimony from anyone who witnessed what he did. Can you provide that? Carenza thought of the files she kept in the back of her closet. the one she had never told anyone about, the photographs she had taken of her own bruises in bathroom mirrors, the discharge paperwork from the ER visit she'd claimed was a fall, the journal entries she had written at 3 in the morning when Desmond was asleep, and the silence was safe enough for truth. "Yes," she said. "I have documentation." "Good. Bring all of it." The third call was the shortest. Cormac spoke a single sentence. "I need the guest suite at Marchford prepared tonight. 2 occupants. 1 adult, 1 child. Indefinite stay." When he hung up, he looked at Carenza. "Your apartment," he said. "The address on your driver's license. Is that where you're living now?" "Yes." "Does Vickers know that address?" Carenza felt her stomach drop. The letter came there. So yes, he knows. "Then you're not going back there tonight. I have a property on the north side. Secure. Staffed. No one enters without clearance. You and your daughter will stay there until this is resolved. I have a shift tomorrow. I'll speak to the hospital administrator in the morning. Your job will be waiting when this is over." Carenza shook her head. The speed of it was dizzying. The phone calls, the lawyer, the safe house. 15 minutes ago, she had been standing alone against an impossible wall. Now the wall was crumbling, and she couldn't quite believe it was real. "This is too much," she said. "You don't owe me anything. Your mother—" "My mother," Cormac interrupted, "is alive right now because someone showed her kindness when her own family failed her. That someone was you." He held her gaze. "This is not payment. This is not debt. This is me doing what I should have done 19 days ago, taking care of the people who take care of the people I love." He handed her a card. It was plain white. No name, just a phone number. "That line reaches me directly, day or night. If you need anything, anything at all, you call that number." Carenza took the card. Her hand was trembling. "I need to get my daughter," she said. "She's at home, with a neighbor. We'll go now. Pack what you need. Leave the rest." "What about your mother? You just got here." Cormac looked at the bed. Aelith was still sleeping, her breath a fragile rhythm in the quiet room. "I'll be back," he said. "But right now, the most important thing I can do for my mother is make sure the woman who showed her kindness doesn't lose her daughter to a man who doesn't deserve either of them." He walked toward the door. Then he stopped and turned back. "Carenza." "Yes? You're not alone anymore. Do you understand? Whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone." The words landed somewhere deep in her chest, in the place where she had learned, years ago, to stop expecting anyone to stay. The place that had hardened into something like acceptance. That place cracked. Just a little. Just enough to let something in. "I understand," she whispered. The house on Marchford Lane didn't look like what Carenza expected. She had imagined something cold. Marble floors and surveillance cameras, and the kind of sterile luxury that rich people used to insulate themselves from the world. What she found instead was a 3-story brownstone with ivy climbing the eastern wall, and a front door painted the deep red of autumn apples. Inside, the floors were hardwood, warm-toned and slightly creaky, in the way old houses always are. There were bookshelves in the living room, filled not with decorator volumes but with actual books. Paperbacks with cracked spines, hardcovers with library stamps, a whole shelf of children's books that made Carenza's throat tighten. "This was my mother's house," Cormac said, as if reading her confusion, "before she got sick. She insisted on living here instead of somewhere more secure. Said it reminded her of the home she grew up in." Blythe was asleep in Carenza's arms, her head heavy against her mother's shoulder. She had woken briefly during the car ride, asked 3 questions. "Where are we going? Is it safe? Can I bring my drawings?" And then fallen back asleep with the absolute trust of a child who believed her mother would handle everything. That trust was the heaviest thing Carenza had ever carried. A woman appeared in the hallway, middle-aged, with kind eyes and a practical manner. "The guest suite is ready," she said to Cormac. "Fresh linens, towels in the bathroom. I've left some things in the kitchen in case the little one is hungry when she wakes." "Thank you, Maeve." Maeve looked at Carenza. Her gaze was assessing but not unkind. "There's a lock on the bedroom door," she said. "A good one. I had it installed myself, years ago, when—" She stopped, glanced at Cormac. "Well, it's there if you need it." Carenza understood what Maeve wasn't saying. She understood that this house had sheltered other women, other children, other people running from things they couldn't name in polite company. "Thank you," she said. The guest suite was on the second floor. It had 2 beds, one full-sized, one smaller, and a window that looked out onto a garden where someone had planted roses that were still holding their last autumn blooms. The walls were painted a soft sage green. There was a reading lamp by each bed, and a small bookshelf stocked with children's books, and a stuffed rabbit sitting on the smaller bed as if it had been waiting for someone to arrive. Carenza laid Blythe on the smaller bed and pulled the covers up to her chin. Blythe stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Mama? I'm here, baby. Where are we?" "Somewhere safe." Blythe looked around the room. Her gaze landed on the stuffed rabbit. She reached for it, pulled it against her chest, and closed her eyes again. "It smells like flowers," she murmured. "It does. I like it here. Good. Go back to sleep." "Mama?" "Yes? Is the door locked?" The question hit Carenza like a physical blow, because Blythe was 9 years old, and she had learned to ask about locked doors. She had learned that safety was something you checked for, something you couldn't assume, something that had to be verified before you could close your eyes. "Yes, baby," Carenza said, though she hadn't locked it yet. "The door is locked." She stood up, walked to the door, turned the deadbolt. The sound it made, solid, certain, final, was the most beautiful sound she had heard in 4 years. Then she sat down on the edge of the full-sized bed, and she put her face in her hands, and she cried. Not quietly, not controlled. She cried the way she had wanted to cry for 4 years, with her whole body, with sounds that came from somewhere beneath language, with the shaking, gasping release of someone who had been holding a weight so long they had forgotten they were holding it. She cried for the woman she had been in Desmond's house, the woman who had shrunk and apologized and made herself small. She cried for the drive through the darkness, for the 4 years of counting eggs, for the letter sitting in her apartment like a threat. She cried for Blythe's glasses and Blythe's art camp and Blythe's voice asking if the door was locked. And somewhere in the middle of all that crying, she felt a small hand on her back. Blythe had gotten out of bed. She was standing beside her mother, still holding the stuffed rabbit, her creek water eyes serious and soft. "It's okay, Mama," Blythe said. "You can cry. I won't tell anyone." Carenza pulled her daughter into her arms and held her so tightly that Blythe made a small sound of protest. But she didn't let go, and Blythe didn't pull away. They stayed like that for a long time, mother and daughter, holding each other in a room that smelled like flowers, behind a door that was finally, truly, locked. Petra Langston had silver hair, a handshake like a vice, and eyes that missed nothing. She met Carenza at her office downtown, a corner suite on the 14th floor with windows overlooking the river. The desk between them was immaculate. The file Carenza had brought was thick. Petra spent 45 minutes reading it. She didn't speak. She didn't react. She just read, turning pages with the methodical patience of someone who had seen worse and won anyway. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked at Carenza. "This is good documentation," she said. "Better than most. The photographs are dated. The journal entries are consistent. The ER records corroborate your account. Most women in your situation don't have this." I knew I might need it someday, Carenza said. I just hoped I wouldn't. Petra nodded. Here's what's going to happen. I'm filing an emergency motion today to dismiss his custody petition. The grounds are domestic violence, which your documentation supports, and the fact that he made no attempt to contact you or your daughter for 4 years until you became financially stable enough to be worth pursuing. Will that work? It will buy us time. The stronger play is the counterpetition. We're going to file for a protective order, and we're going to subpoena his records. His records? Petra's smile was thin and sharp. Mr. Vickers has been busy since you left him. My investigators... She paused. And some associates of Mr. Brenna's have uncovered a pattern. 2 other women. Similar circumstances. Similar escalation. One of them filed a police report that was mysteriously lost. The other left the state and hasn't been heard from since. Carenza felt cold. You think I think he's a dangerous man who has spent years learning how to operate just inside the line the law can see. But the law can be made to see more clearly when you know where to shine the light. She slid a document across the desk. This is a temporary restraining order. I'm filing it this afternoon. It prohibits him from coming within 500 feet of you or your daughter. It prohibits contact by any means. Phone, email, letter, third party. Violation is a criminal offense. Carenza stared at the document. Her hands were shaking. He's going to be angry, she said. Yes, Petra agreed. He is. But anger is not power, Ms. Morrow. Documentation is power. Legal representation is power. And right now, you have both. The restraining order was granted the next day. The custody petition was dismissed 6 days later, not because Desmond withdrew it, but because the judge reviewed the evidence and found that the petition had been filed in bad faith as a means of harassment and control. The judge's language was precise. The petitioner has demonstrated no genuine interest in the welfare of the child, and substantial evidence suggests the petition is intended as an instrument of coercion against the respondent. Desmond Vickers was not arrested, but a file was opened. Detectives in 2 jurisdictions began making phone calls. The other women were contacted. Patterns were documented. And 3 weeks after the night in the hospital room, a man in a dark suit visited Desmond at his office in Coalbridge. The man didn't introduce himself. He didn't make threats. He simply placed a folder on Desmond's desk. A folder containing photographs, records, testimony, and said, Mr. Brenna wants you to understand that Carenza Morrow and her daughter are under his protection. He also wants you to understand that certain information has been shared with appropriate authorities and will continue to be shared if you make any attempt to contact them, directly or indirectly, for any reason, ever again. The man paused. Mr. Brenna is not a patient man, and he has a long memory. Do you understand? Desmond understood. He would not contact Carenza again. He would not contact Blythe. He would, in fact, sell his house in Coalbridge 6 months later and move to a different state, where he would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder at shadows that may or may not have been following him. Some threats don't need to be spoken to be heard. On a Thursday afternoon in late November, Carenza and Blythe moved into a new apartment. It was a 2-bedroom in a building with a doorman and a security system and a playground visible from the kitchen window. The rent was covered for a year through a fund Petra had connected her to, a fund for survivors, Petra called it, established by donors who preferred to remain anonymous. Carenza suspected she knew who at least one of those donors was. She didn't ask. The apartment had a bedroom for Blythe, with walls that could be painted any color she wanted. Blythe chose yellow, not pale yellow, but the bright, confident yellow of sunflowers and school buses and happy endings. Because yellow is the color of brave, Blythe explained. Carenza didn't argue. The first night in the new apartment, Blythe walked to the front door without being asked. She reached up, She had to stand on her tiptoes and turn the deadbolt herself. Then she turned around and looked at her mother with those creek-water eyes. "Now it's ours," she said, and she smiled. Not the careful smile of a child who had learned to be still. A real smile. The kind that started at her mouth and traveled to her eyes and didn't stop until it reached somewhere deep inside her chest, the place where trust lives, or where trust begins to rebuild. Carenza knelt down and pulled her daughter into her arms. "Yes, baby," she said. "Now it's ours." 3 months later, on a February afternoon when the sky was the pale gray of old silver, Carenza walked through the doors of St. Aldrich's Memorial for the last time. She was not there for a shift. She had transferred to a different hospital, a better one, with better pay and better hours and colleagues who noticed when she skipped lunch and insisted she eat. The transfer had been arranged quietly, through channels Carenza didn't examine too closely, by people whose names she had never been told. She was there to say goodbye. Room 414 was empty now. The bed had been stripped to its mattress. The single chair sat in the corner, waiting for someone else. The window still looked out onto the parking lot, but someone had hung a small plant on the sill, a gesture of hope, or perhaps just a way of filling the silence. Aelith Brenna had died 11 days ago. She had not died alone. In her final weeks, Cormac had come every day. Sometimes he sat in the chair and read to her from books she had loved when he was a child. Sometimes he just held her hand and watched her sleep. Once, Carenza had arrived for a visit and found him singing, low and rough and off-key, a song his mother had sung to him 40 years ago, when he was small enough to be carried and the world was simple enough to fit in a lullaby. Aelith had died on a Tuesday morning, with the winter sun coming through the window and her son's hand in hers. Her last words, the nurse on duty reported, were, "You came back." Cormac had not spoken at the funeral. He had stood at the back of the church, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the casket. But afterward, when the other mourners had left and the pews were empty, he had walked to the front of the church and placed something on the altar. A photograph, black and white, creased with age, a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, holding a baby in her arms, smiling at the camera with the uncomplicated joy of someone who still believed the world was kind. Carenza had seen the photograph. She had recognized the woman. Now she stood in room 414 and looked at the empty bed and thought about all the women who had lain in beds like this one, alone, forgotten, wondering if anyone would come. Not all of them had someone who came back. But Aelith had. In the end, Aelith had. There was a sound behind her. Carenza turned. Cormac was standing in the doorway. He looked older than he had 3 months ago. Not in years, but in weight. The weight of grief, of reckoning, of promises made and broken and finally, imperfectly, kept. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "I wanted to see it one more time, before I—" She stopped, shook her head. "I don't know why. It doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense." He walked into the room and stood beside her, both of them facing the window. "This is where it started. It makes sense to come back." "How are you?" Carenza asked. Cormac considered the question. "I'm not sure," he said honestly. "I spent 40 years building walls. She spent her last weeks tearing them down. I'm still adjusting to the view." "She loved you. She never stopped." "I know. That's the part that's hard to carry." They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, a car pulled into the parking lot. Someone walked across the faded lines toward the entrance, shoulders hunched against the February cold. "Blythe made you something," Carenza said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "She wanted me to give it to you. She's been working on it for weeks." Cormac took the paper, unfolded it. It was a drawing. Colored pencil on thick art paper. The good kind. The kind from the summer camp Blythe had finally attended, paid for by money that had once seemed impossible. The drawing showed a hospital room, a bed by a window, a woman lying in the bed with gray hair and closed eyes, and beside the bed, two figures, a man in a dark suit, holding the woman's hand, and a smaller figure, a girl with auburn hair and a yellow dress, standing in the doorway, watching. At the bottom, in careful letters, Blythe had written, "Nobody should be alone." Cormac stared at the drawing. His jaw worked. His eyes glistened with something he would never have allowed anyone else to see. "She sees things," he said quietly. "Your daughter. She sees things most people miss. She always has. She's going to be remarkable. She already is." Cormac folded the drawing carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, over his heart. "Thank you," he said. "For this. For her. For everything you did for my mother when I wasn't here to do it myself." "You came back," Carenza said. "That's what mattered to her. That you came back." He nodded, looked at the window one more time, then turned toward the door. "Carenza?" "Yes? If you ever need anything, anything at all." "I know. I have the number." He almost smiled. "You do? Don't hesitate to use it." He walked out of the room. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, steady and sure, growing fainter until they disappeared. Carenza stood alone in room 414 for another moment. She looked at the empty bed, the single chair, the plant on the windowsill, reaching toward the pale winter light. Then she turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. That evening, Carenza made dinner in her yellow-walled kitchen while Blythe sat at the table doing homework. The radiator in this apartment didn't clang. The locks on the door were strong. The refrigerator was full. "Mom?" Blythe said, looking up from her math worksheet. "Yeah, baby? Did you give him my drawing?" "I did. He loved it." Blythe nodded, satisfied. She returned to her homework, her pencil moving across the page with the focused intensity of a child who had learned that the world could be cruel, but had also learned, recently, tentatively, with great care, that it could be kind. Carenza watched her daughter for a moment. The auburn hair, the creek water eyes, the gap-toothed smile that emerged when she solved a problem correctly. She thought about the woman she had been 4 years ago, driving through darkness with nothing but a sleeping child and a prayer. She thought about the woman she had been 3 months ago, counting down days with a letter in her pocket and no way forward. She thought about Aelith Brenna, who had survived 30 years of brutality and raised 3 children and worked at a textile mill and prayed every night even when she wasn't sure anyone was listening. She thought about Cormac, the boy who had hidden behind furniture while his father raged, the man who had built an empire, the son who had come back too late and stayed anyway. And she thought about the drawing Blythe had made, the careful letters at the bottom. Nobody should be alone. It was true, Carenza realized. It was the truest thing she knew. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't. Outside, the February darkness settled over the city. Streetlights flickered on. Somewhere, a church bell rang the hour. And in an apartment with yellow walls and strong locks and a refrigerator full of food, a mother and daughter sat together in the warm light, doing homework and making dinner, breathing the ordinary air of a life that had finally, after everything, become safe. The deadbolt on the front door held firm. It would hold firm tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days that followed. Because some doors, once locked against the darkness, stay locked forever. And some promises, once kept, never need to be spoken again.